Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our live webinar, Navigating the Challenges to AI Success. We're very, very excited to share this webinar with you guys, this content. We have a guest speaker with us here today, and we're very excited to have him by the name of Randy Bean. He's well known in the AI space. He's a best-selling author, he's a founder, he's an advisor, he's a CEO. Is there anything you haven't done, Randy?
I'm still working on it.
And we have two speakers with us here today who actually have a wealth of knowledge in the AI space. We have Chris Stevens, he's our CTO and head of applied AI at Appen, and of course, Randy Bean that I spoke about earlier. Chris, do you want to give a brief introduction for those on the call on who you are and what you do at Appen before heading off to Randy?
Sure. Morning, everybody. Afternoon, everybody that they're joining us from around the world. Megan, thank you for that. It's wonderful to be here. Like you said, I'm the field CTO here at Appen, and I'm head of applied AI. So my team help customers build and implement AI systems, Gen AI systems in all different contexts and industries around the world. I've been a data and analytics wanderer and practitioner for all of my career. I'm a three-time chief data officer. I'm a member of the faculty at Carnegie Mellon, teaching in some data and AI courses, and spending my days today, like I said, helping big companies around the world understand what it is they're supposed to do with AI and help them build and implement large AI systems. So wonderful to be here. Happy, excited to talk about this topic. Great to see you again, Randy. Randy, want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Randy Bean. Have been in the space for longer than I'd care to admit, I guess about 40 years now, working with Fortune 1000 companies, helping them leverage data and AI in their businesses. And along the way, I've done a lot of writing. So for 2 years, I wrote a monthly column in the Wall Street Journal on big data, 2014 to 2015. I've continued that with Forbes, where I write about 1 to 2 articles per month talking about various companies and what they're doing in terms of leveraging AI and data. I also write about 3 pieces a year for Harvard Business Review, and I've been, for the past 3 years, writing a 6-part series for MIT Sloan Management Review called AI in Action, co-authored with my colleague, Tom Davenport. And as mentioned, during COVID, I had the time, so I wrote the book, Fail Fast, Learn Faster, Lessons in Data-Driven Leadership in an Age of Disruption, Big Data, and AI. And I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you. So as mentioned, these are some of the things I've done. Also, it's interesting because there's been so much written about AI lately, and in just the past few months have been quoted in the New York Times on the topic of whether organizations need a chief AI officer, and The Economist in terms of sorting through all of the information, news about AI, and also in the Wall Street Journal based upon a fireside keynote chat I did at Deloitte University several months ago. I had also been, as mentioned, I was a founder and CEO of a company, New Vantage Partners, which advised Fortune 1000 clients on data and AI. And after running that company for 21 years, I sold the business in 2023, and I've retired from full-time employment at the start of this year. One other thing that I think I'd add at this point is that I think it's very important to maintain perspective when one thinks about AI and where AI fits within their organization. And I thought it was interesting on the opening slide, Appen says, serving global AI programs since 1993. And I think that's great because it's important to realize that AI has actually been around for quite a long time in various ways. So 1993, that's what, 31, 32 years now. In December, I was speaking at an event at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University here in Boston, where I live. And it was divided into 2 days. The first day was a Chief Data Officer Day, and I organized and moderated the keynote panel for that day. And the second day was billed as the first ever Chief AI Officer Day. And I made a comment just before we're about to kick off to the event organizers, and I said, Chief AI Officer Day. I said, I thought the first one of those was held in 1962. and they kind of looked like they misheard me or whatever. But the point is that, and in subsequent weeks, I spoke to people that had been involved in AI for many years, and they said, "Oh, back in the '60s, this was done, and back in the '60s, this was done." And I said, yeah, people often don't understand that because I made that comment at this event, which was billed as the first Chief AI Officer event, and it went completely over people's heads. So it's important to remember that organizations and academics and others have been working at this now for 50 odd years or longer. And we've reached a point that computing power and availability of data has now really made this commercially available across a range of applications. So moving to the next slide, one of the things that I've been conducting for the past dozen years is a survey of Fortune 1000 data leaders. So one of the things that I've done for many years is organize a roundtable events of Fortune 1000 data leaders, and in the period from 2000 to 2010 or so, that was primarily CIOs because they were the people that owned data for many organizations, and subsequently this evolved into roundtables that it was CDOs. So in the course of that, one of the data leaders in about 2012 said, it was actually a CIO from JP Morgan. They said, we're hearing a lot about big data. Is this something that we should care about? Is this something that organizations are really investing in, or is it just like the latest fad? So what we did was we kicked off a survey. The survey has now been running for 12 years, as mentioned, and it's become the longest running annual survey of Fortune 1000 senior executives. Roughly 97% of the respondents hold a C executive title. Roughly 93% are chief data officers. And I want to share with you some of the findings from this survey. So moving to the next slide. So as mentioned, it's important to appreciate that these are really leading companies across a range of industries, and they vary from well-known brands like Colgate-Palmolive to leaders in financial services that are very data-driven, such as Capital One. There's global companies such as Emirates, Bentley out of the UK, and even as diverse companies as the National Football League. So it's a good spectrum and a good benchmark of what leading companies are doing. And as you can see, this year was actually 89.8% of the respondents who held the title of Chief Data Officer, Chief Analytics Officer, or even now Chief AI Officer for their organizations. So moving to the next slide. So I'm going to share with you 5 findings from the event. So the first thing we asked was, or the first finding is that companies see AI as potentially the most transformative technology in a generation. We asked a number of questions in terms of the state of investment in generative AI. And as noted, 62.3, close to 2/3 say that investment in generative AI has become a top organizational priority. 89% said they were increasing their investments in generative AI. And interestingly, 2/3 said that generative AI has the potential to be the most transformative technology in a generation. So the point here is that Fortune 1000 companies are paying serious attention to AI and generative AI. At the same time, we asked, is there a need for safeguards and guardrails for governing generative AI? The response was almost unanimous. I'm not sure what the other 1% were thinking. We also asked about safeguards and guardrails, whether they're in place today. Again, just less than 2/3 of organizations, and only half said that the talent was in place today to responsibly implement generative AI. So in spite of all the interest, there's a lot of need and opportunity and gap to be closed in terms of establishing the safeguards and guardrails and having the talent in place. Moving to the next finding. So finding 2 was that AI presents business opportunities but poses risks as well. So the point here is if you're a Fortune 1000 company, you need to be very thoughtful in terms of your planning and your adoption and how you take on AI within your organization. because in spite of the great potential in areas such as achieving productivity gains, where half of the organizations see that as a primary opportunity, there's also risks as well. Just in terms of the opportunity side, mentioned productivity gains in some companies that I've written about, such as Ally Financial, are actually measuring these productivity gains in their customer services functions and publishing the results. So it's interesting to see firms that are going public in terms of the measurements and the quantifying the results that they gain, as opposed to general articulation of, well, we're developing plans. Another key area where companies saw opportunity was to liberate knowledge workers from mundane tasks. The other side of that, the corollary, is that often there's a fear of job displacement. Elon Musk last week actually made the statement that AI would eliminate all jobs within the next few years. Well, Elon Musk likes to make broad statements, and it's interesting to think about. It's unlikely to happen in the next 5 years, but one way to think about this is that computers can take on a lot of the mundane cognitive tasks, but that also frees individuals to be more creative, to think about synthesis, and to basically undertake higher level activities. Sometimes I have to speak to audiences that know absolutely nothing about AI, and they ask me about fears of job loss. And I said, look at it this way. One opportunity is that you can be the CEO of a whole bunch of AIs, and you can just say, do my taxes for me, pay my bills, all of these type of activities. So this will evolve over time, but that's really the point about liberating knowledge workers. And then improving customer service and experience, and that ties into this increase in productivity gains as well, where you can have, now you can contact companies and be put on hold or go through endless processes, and a lot of that can be streamlined more effectively through generative AI. On the risk side, clearly the biggest risk that organizations fear is the spread of misinformation or disinformation. And if you're a Fortune 1000 company, a leading company that has a reputation and customer base that's been built over many years, this is a serious concern that you have to take into account, hence the need for safeguards and guardrails. So Fortune 1000 companies have an opportunity to leverage AI in a positive fashion, but they also need to be cautious because of the responsibilities that they have to their customers and stakeholders, as well as issues of ethical bias. And we talked about job loss and job displacement. So it's important for Fortune 1000 companies to balance out the gains as well as the risks and come up with a thoughtful plan so that they can implement AI in an effective fashion. Moving to finding 3. Implementation and adoption of generative AI remains at an early stage for most organizations. So I was reading something this morning. I mean, there's not a day that passes where there isn't new information about AI. So just this morning, I read a study that said 2023 was the year of experimentation in AI, and 2024 will be the year of adoption in AI. That remains to be seen, but it's an interesting premise, and it's supported by the data. So as you can see here, we asked about the state of generative AI implementation efforts, and the bottom line was that less than 5% had implemented AI initiatives at scale. Most organizations, just under 2/3, were in the experimentation and testing stage. Others had moved into implementation, limited production, and some were in the planning and design stage. But again, at this point in time, and this survey was taken in December of last year and published in January of this year, so it's still relatively fresh. Very few organizations had implemented Gen AI and AI capabilities at scale within their organizations. Moving to finding 4 on the next slide. Companies recognize that integrating new capabilities like data and AI in traditional business processes remain a challenge. And this is one of the most fascinating statistics for me that I share year after year, because we ask 5 questions. And I want to talk about up to 2023 and then talk about 2024. So if you'd asked me a year ago in 2023 about these questions, I'd say, we asked whether you were driving business innovation with data. 59.5% said yes, so that's not bad. Are you competing on data and analytics? 40.8% said yes. So really only 2 out of 5 and 3 out of 5 were not. So, that's okay, but not phenomenal. Are you managing data as a business asset? Again, it was right around 40%. So 2 out of 5 were doing this and 3 out of 5 weren't. So, okay, but not great. Have you created a data-driven organization? Only 23.9% said yes. So that was really a very poor outcome. And then the other question that we asked was, and I think we just lost the slide there for a moment. The other question was, have you established a data and analytics culture? And only 20.6% had replied yes. So it was really 1 out of 5. So given the decades that we've been working at this, the fact that only a small number of organizations in relative terms had created a data-driven organization, established a data and analytics culture, that really pointed to the challenges associated with this. However, in 2024, there was some good news, and we really see this as driven by the interest in generative AI and how it had elevated the importance of data within Fortune 1000 companies. So as a consequence, you see the jump in numbers. Driving business innovation with data jumped from 59.5% to 77%. Competing on data and analytics jumped from 40% to 50%. Managing data as a business asset jumped from 39 to 49%. So these are roughly 20%, 25% increases. Data-driven, creating a data-driven organization for the first time jumped substantially from 23% to nearly half, and establish a data and analytics culture doubled to 42.6%. So something is happening here driven by generative AI. And one of those things is that organizations are paying much greater attention to their data, because we all know that without great data, you can't have great AI. So this is a significant development in the evolution of organizations becoming data-driven. And then the last finding that I want to share is that when the day is done, here we go on slide on finding number 5, changing organization culture remains the biggest obstacle to adoption of AI and becoming data-driven. And it's not really about the technology. The technology, for the most part, is there. It's really about change management, people, process, culture, organization, natural resistance. These are the challenges that organizations face, skills. So for most organizations to become AI driven or to leverage AI in their businesses, there's an abundance of steps that they need to take in terms of educating their people, educating their leaders, training their people, changing their processes, coming up with the optimal organization. We could talk about this as a whole topic in and of itself. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Chris to share some of his thoughts. And just one other thing is that I write a lot, and there's a series of articles in case you're interested in reading them. And at the end, we'll share a link with you, which you can go to find any of these articles.
Great, thanks, Randy. Yeah, I mentioned in my introduction that I spend my days talking to companies large and small all around the world about how to bring generative AI or AI systems to life in their organizations. So I have sort of anecdotal evidence that matches up against the findings, that you've quantified in your study and that I've seen in similar studies. And first of all, I appreciate you acknowledging Appen's been at this for a long time. We've been working in the deep learning and AI data space, like you said, for nearly 30 years. And what's interesting to us is, as of about a year and a half ago, this suddenly was on everybody's mind. And like I also said, having been a data leader myself for most of my career, it is great to see movement in some of those metrics that you talk about in your study, where organizations are starting to feel like they really are competing and they really are getting their data sort of infrastructure, loosely speaking, meaning technology plus teams and systems and processes, ready for what they're trying to do with AI. I'm actually doing a talk tomorrow at Carnegie Mellon on if your data is not ready for BI, how's it going to be ready for AI, right? So getting that data foundation ready is so important. And so, what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about just some things that I'm seeing and hearing anecdotally as I'm out there in the world talking to customers and how they kind of match up against your findings. And so they're, finding one, there's a lot of investment that's happening in data analytics, and organizations are expecting to deliver big value against that. And I'm definitely seeing the same thing, a lot of experimentation and learning. I like to think that the market for what a company like Appen does, or the market for what, other companies in the AI space do, kind of exists in three parts. The first part are your hyperscalers or your foundation model builders. Think of your Anthropics and your Cohere, NVIDIA, Amazon, Meta, these kinds of companies. And kind of to your point, they've been at this for a long time. And this isn't new to them. The way a lot of their systems work leverage technologies like this in the background, right? And we've had the luxury and the privilege of working with a lot of these similar organizations for a long time. So this isn't new to them. That's kind of the first part of this market. The third part, skipping the second part on purpose, the third part are kind of your Fortune 500, your Global 2000, your typical organizations that you talked about, maybe some that you sampled, for this survey. And it very much looks to me like it's early. So if you're in one of these, Global 2000 type organizations, probably like Randy's data suggests, you're in experimentation and testing. And that's kind of what it looks like to me as I'm out there talking to organizations. They're trying to learn and understand what are the patterns they should be putting in place. And in the middle bucket, what's interesting to me is it's your kind of your cloud native businesses, some of these software platforms on which all of our businesses run, large organizations that are not these hyperscalers, but they're sort of tech native companies. And there definitely is like a existential need there. And it's one of the things that I'm curious to see how it unfolds is, companies like ServiceNow and Workday and SAP and others, where business processes run there today. They sort of run our industries. Is that where all the generative AI capabilities are going to be infused into their platforms? Likely they're trying, right? Or will there be disruption that comes from the outside? I think it's going to be interesting to see how that unfolds. So there's a lot of activity and energy happening there. You talked about, the potentially most transformative technology in a generation, and finding number two here. And, you mentioned knowledge workers, building systems to make the work of knowledge workers easier. And I'm definitely, again, seeing the same kinds of use cases. What's interesting is that, there's some examples that I've seen, some industries across financial services, telco, healthcare, and others, where it's sort of the same use case, but two sides of the same, meaning one, there is how do I enable access to knowledge and information through things like an LLM for a customer so they can better understand, how a company's services, work for them, how their plan applies, maybe it's their 401k or their cell phone plan, whatever it is, how does that apply to them specifically, and what are the things they need to do to maximize what they're getting from that plan? And then there's like the inverse use case, which is for the internal person, whether it's the internal advisor inside of a financial services organization or like a tech at a telco, how do they triage problems in the network and so on using technologies like this? So seeing, that knowledge worker use case is definitely prevailing. And it's something I just wanted to touch on and kind of put into people's minds if they're not aware. So this retrieval augmented generation architecture, RAG architecture, as I have called out on the slide, right now is kind of the prevailing approach that organizations seem to be taking to implement LLM or generative AI capabilities into their organization. So it's less about proper fine tuning, less about RLHF, reinforcement learning with human feedback on a foundation model, but more building this RAG architecture around the model to optimize its ability to answer questions and understand your domain context. So just something for folks to keep in mind as they're contemplating building out these systems. You mentioned change management. I've said once or twice now that I've been an industry data leader for most of my career. And for those of you that are thinking about, how to bring these things to life, just like Randy, I can't underscore enough that the success of a program like this, your ability to bring a generative AI system to life in your organization, or even this, kind of standard data transformation work, really does come down to change management. and it probably is amplified now when you talk about job loss, job replacement, that managing people through that change and helping them understand the positive benefit that this can have for themselves is certainly going to be an absolute key to being successful. On that note, history has taught us that just about every meaningful innovation that's happened over time has created more economic opportunity than it has displaced. I had seen a statistic from McKinsey where I think it's about 2.5 jobs were created for every one that was displaced by the internet. So yes, the internet and the technology that's brought on the world in the last 25 years had some displacement. It's almost hard to imagine at this point the displacement that took place between the late 90s and the mid 2000s based on the internet. But according to McKinsey, 2.5 jobs were replaced for everyone, or were created for everyone that was replaced. So that, again, there's change that needs to be managed, but optimistically, history teaches us that innovations like this create more economic opportunity than they displace. And then the last one, you talked about AI safeguards. I was thinking the same thing, by the way. Who was the 1% that answered we don't need AI safeguards in place? But yes, having safeguards in place, looking at techniques like red teaming. So in the AI space, we're sort of borrowing from our cybersecurity friends the concept of red teaming and how do you almost ethically hack and ethically work against your LLM to ensure that you're training it against toxicity, harm, and bias. And that's work, by the way, that Appen does with some of our customers. And I also want to make people aware of, the National Institute of Science and Technology has come out with something called the AI Risk Management Framework. You can see I've got it there in parentheses. And it is not regulation today. I don't know if it'll become regulation or not, but the White House came out with some guidance around AI risk management. It's largely based on the work that came out of NIST. And I would, again, just try to make folks on the webinar aware that it is really great guidance in terms of how to think about risk, what are the dimensions of risk, how to measure that risk, how to talk about and report on it, and then again, how to build systems to mitigate that. So certainly something that people are thinking about. And because we're at the beginning, as your data talked about and some of my anecdotes allude to, now is the time to think about that. Because these systems, these AI systems, generative AI systems are different than the kind of machine learning systems that you may have been deploying in your organization over the past 10, 15, 20 years. There's a stochastic nature to these, meaning there's randomness that is innate in these generative AI systems. So you run a recommender system and you've got some variables that predict outcome and you recommend the kind of outfits that Randy might want to wear. You're generally going to get the same answer. They're a lot more probabilistic and even become deterministic when you implement them as rules. These systems, these chatbots, LLMs, generative AI, they're stochastic in nature, meaning there's randomness. So building that risk management framework around it from the beginning so that you can control for, that you can guardrail against, again, toxicity, harm, hallucination, all the kinds of things that you don't want coming out to your customers, I think is going to be a really important thing. But I just wanted to share again some sort of anecdotes that I'm seeing out there from the world relative to the data-driven findings that Randy put together.
And by the way, Chris, I think the 1% are, over the course of my career, I've walked into various executive meetings and there's always somebody sitting there with their arms folded saying, we have everything completely under control.
Right. Yep. Exactly. We don't need it because we've already got it, right?
That's right.
So, as people are putting their questions together, Randy, I wanted to come back to something you and I talked about as we were, preparing for this webinar. And I like to think about going back in time to 2010. And Mark Andreessen writes his seminal piece that sort of launches this digital transformation era. Software is eating the world. And if we went back in time and we looked at what happened, what we thought was going to happen from 2010 going forward, there was pretty high expectation that, all these organizations were going to become digitally native, that large organizations were going to essentially turn into no longer banks, but they're software companies that offer financial services and so on and so forth. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, that's not exactly what happened, right? That yes, a lot of great innovation has taken place, but the expectation that we had, say, 15 years ago hasn't been quite achieved. And I'm curious your thinking, because like you said, you talked to a lot of different people in a lot of different contexts, academics, industry leaders, and so on. What are some of the things you think we can do to prevent that same level of hype and expectation, and then not quite meeting where we're getting where we thought we were going to get to, given that a year and a half ago or so, we probably entered into this new era? I don't know. What are your thoughts there, Randy?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts, Chris. First of all, it's important for everyone to understand that if you look at Fortune 1000 companies, so the biggest market cap companies in the United States, 90% of those companies are 50 years older, 50 years old or older, which fundamentally means that they're legacy companies. Roughly 10% have been born within the past 50 years, and those tend to be the digitally native. And just because those happen in and of themselves to have the highest market cap for individual companies, the largest total market cap still lies with those other 90%. And so the point is that those 90%, they don't need to be competing with Google and with Meta and with Apple and so forth. They need to be competing with the other 90%. So if you're an insurance company, you're competing with the other insurance company. If you're a bank, you're competing with the other banks. And so, for example, with the introduction of the internet, which is now 25 to 30 years old, I remember during COVID, a couple of the Fortune 1000 companies that I've worked with said that we've done more in terms of executing on our digital transition plan during COVID than we did during the previous 20 years. Okay. So it was necessity became the mother of invention because they couldn't interact with people on a personal level and had to do it virtually. That gave a real practical reason to implement capabilities that were maybe in the plan, but were theoretical. They were nice to have as opposed to need to have. Now, there's exceptions to the rule. Companies like Capital One in financial services, for example, I mean, these were data and analytics people that said, how can we apply our data and analytics theories? And they saw an opportunity to do that within credit cards and underserved credit card markets, and ultimately provided full service banking services. So within every industry, there's companies that come in and innovate, but for the most part, most companies are proceeding at a more gradual pace. They're preserving their customer base, and they don't need to adopt all these capabilities any quicker than their other competitors.
Yeah, interesting. The other thing we talked about was, you mentioned the internet. So, what's the grounding analogy for what's happening now? And I had mentioned to you that I happen to think, Kevin, I see your hand. If you want to throw your question in the Q&A, by the way, we can pull it up here, Kevin. I happen to think my grounding analogy, Randy, as I mentioned to you, is electricity. So the impact that I think generative AI and AI capabilities will have on the world is analogous to electricity. I mentioned to you that I saw a podcast with Chamath the other day, and he mentions refrigeration. So I'm going to use this one because it's pretty interesting. That certainly there was a lot of money made in refrigeration by those people that had invented refrigeration, but it was Coca-Cola really that maybe has capitalized the most on refrigeration. And so if you take whether it's electricity or refrigeration, and you go back in time, for electricity, we're basically saying it's 1880 right now. We haven't even conceived of the industries that are going to benefit the most, that will create the most opportunity for humanity based off of this new technology. Like even just tying back to the internet, e-commerce, social media, right? These things hadn't mobile. When you go back to the origins of the internet or the browser becoming predominant in the 90s, these things didn't even exist in the world. So I don't know if this is a question, but it's just fascinating for me to think about, like, what are the things that are going to be spawned off of this innovation?
Yeah, it's a question that I get all of the time and that I hear frequently, and it's kind of like pick your change or pick your metaphor. I think if one's conservatively speaking, you can pretty much safely say that this is going to be the most transformational technology since the internet. Okay. If one wants to be more ambitious, one can say since computing, since electricity, since the airplane, since the railroad. I mean, one of my favorite, it wasn't a technological change, but it brought great change to civilizations in North America was when horses were brought from Spain, because then people could, there were Native American cultures that didn't even realize that there were other tribes just a few miles down the road because it was different worlds. And so it really led to integration. One of the analogies a lot of people use is the printing press. But these things can get out of hand. And I went to an event recently, and there were leaders from technology and Fortune 1000 business leaders, and I was actually a little bit astonished because multiple times people stated, this is the biggest transformational technology in the history of mankind. It's quite early to say that. I'm not sure the evidence is there to support that. I'm not sure that that's constructive and productive because it also leads to hype and backlash and so forth. So if one wants to be conservative, the answer would be the internet. And if one wants to be moderately ambitious, we can take it back to the 1880s.
Yeah, and you mentioned hype in the middle there. Just any practical guidance, you said you've been doing this for a long time, you've been in and around this industry and you've been a thought leader for a long time here. So what are some practical things that teams can do? One, to sort of get started, but two, to avoid the hype. And I'm going to add one addendum to my question, which will lead into my next question. But as a leader, your board, your CEO, they're consuming information and they're, potentially becoming prone to the hype. So as a leader in this space, how do you manage into that complex environment where there's hype, there's expectations, and you're also accountable for delivery?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this question a couple different ways. So since the introduction of generative AI in the fall of what it would have been 2022, level of awareness of AI was of an order of magnitude, and people in the general public and so forth. And I found that people were coming up to me from basically two schools. There were those, and let's call these people not fully educated. But there was one school of people that said, wow, this is amazing. Computers will be able to make up and imagine all of these things, or AI will. And I said, well, that's not exactly how computers work. And then there's a second set of people that said, oh, how can you work in this field because AI is going to destroy humanity? And I was like, well, just kind of chill out a little bit. But I do have the opportunity, and so I hadn't fully formed a position. I had the opportunity this past October to go to the Wall Street Journal Tech Live event in Laguna Beach, and it was a small gathering, and Sam Altman was the keynote speaker. It turns out a week later he was fired, and 2 weeks later he was rehired. But one of the questions for him, and this is trying to put this whole Gen AI thing into perspective, they asked him about artificial general intelligence. And the first question they said, can you define artificial general intelligence? And he said, yes, that is the state where a computer can perform any cognitive task better than a human being. And I said, okay, well, we'll accept that. And then they said, the second question, when will that become available, commercially available in some form? And he said, well, that's an interesting question, because if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said within the next decade. If you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said within the next 5 years. If you'd asked me a couple of weeks ago, I would have said in the next 2 years, maybe. If you'd asked me last week, I'd say maybe in the next year. If you're asking me tonight, I need to go back to the lab to check. So a lot of these things are happening a lot quicker than even the people that are most involved in them anticipated. And, Gen AI, in terms of the much larger picture of artificial general intelligence and other forms of AI, is just a tiny aspect. So we're really at the earliest stages of what could potentially be, as you've noted, Chris, one of the biggest transformations that people have known in the past couple centuries.
Yeah, and then sort of counterbalancing that, we had a question from the audience, and the question is really about, specifically mentions GDPR, but I think it's about, barriers to adoption. And, certainly protecting your data, protecting customers' privacy is important. Maybe there's 1% that would say that it weren't, like your guardrails question, but certainly these things are important. But what we don't want them to be is barriers to innovation and adoption. So any thoughts on, moving forward and how you can sort of work around some of these old, mindsets around perhaps overly cautious, or, the kinds of, again, it's not so much change management as it is, what are some of the things that companies can do to get started to start moving past some of these barriers?
Well, the book I wrote was entitled Fail Fast, Learn Faster. So that's all about iterative experimentation, and it's how about companies in the data space really started, instead of waiting to have all their ducks lined up, they set up centers of excellence, or they targeted specific areas for experimentation. So that's something that any company can begin to do today. And as those capabilities mature, they can be basically incorporated into production. So there's no reason that organizations can't be very aggressive today in terms of their experimentation. They just need to do that within a context that there's a process in place by which you shift these things into production once the safeguards are in place.
And then I got two more questions. One, we've talked about different strategies of getting started. I love the fail fast, learn faster. I absolutely think that's the right way for people to go. What about leadership? Organizations today, you've mentioned chief AI officers, chief data officers, and so on. What about leadership? I mean, are you seeing patterns shifting where AI officers are emerging, roles are combining, where CDOs and CTOs perhaps? Like, what are some patterns you're seeing in that leadership space?
Yeah, this is a subject I could talk for hours on, but let me try to put things into perspective. So the chief data officer role, for the most part, has only existed for the past 15 years or so, and a lot of that came out of the mandates from the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And when that role started, it was largely a defensive role. In other words, it was focused on risk and regulatory activities. But once those things were under control, so to speak, within the next 5 to 7 years, organizations integrated the analytics function, so it evolved from a chief data officer role to a chief data and analytics officer role. And people that held those positions became more focused on offensive or business generation activities. So CDOs are still a relatively new role. If you look back a generation, CIO was a new role, and the joke at that time was career is over because it was such a tenuous position. That's what CDOs are experiencing now. I've written about the fact that the average CDO tenure has been about 2 years. There's a lot of data that we've gathered saying that organizations still don't understand what the role is, and there's various manifestations of what the role could be. It's important to think in terms of those organizations that are thinking about a chief AI officer, because of the safeguards and guardrails that we mentioned. Initially, a lot of the work around that role is going to be to put those defensive capabilities in place. So in the way that the CDO role has evolved into much more of an offensive role, to the extent that organizations have a chief AI officer as a distinct role, it's going to need to focus on those defensive activities. But to your larger question, the chief data officer role in any form is continuing to evolve, and whether AI falls within that role, how organizations organize everything around data and AI and analytics, this is very much a work in progress, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Randy. One last thing, I don't know if this is a question more than a comment, but we talked about mitigating risk, building those defensive postures in your leadership function, in your C-level role, whoever's going to be responsible, and all these different ways about getting started and failing faster and all these different things. And, I would be remiss, especially as a representative of Appen. And, Appen's role in this industry for the past 30 years has been bringing humans into the life cycle of the development of AI, whether it's through the creation and management of data or the infusion of human feedback into AI life cycles. So I would be remiss without bringing this back to humans. And so the thing that I would leave folks with is, as you begin to experiment, as you begin to try and learn, fail faster, learn faster, to Randy's point, is these systems, because they're, like I said, stochastic in nature, there's randomness that's involved. It's just imperative, absolutely imperative, that there is a human layer that is involved in the curation and preparation of your data, in the evaluation of the prompts and responses that you're building into your system. I talked about red teaming briefly, that there's this constant role that human input, feedback, perspective is playing, judgment is playing as you're building out, experimenting, and launching these platforms. So I don't know if, Randy, you have any other last thoughts, but the one last thing I'm going to say is, when people ask me what's going to happen, is this going to destroy humanity? I think the most prescient science fiction work of science fiction is going to turn out to be the movie WALL-E. And if you ask me what's going to happen, is, I'm not saying I love the outcome, but we're going to automate away as much of the toil of life as we possibly can. And maybe it'll be the robots that bring the humanity back to us in the end. So anyways, Randy, back to you.
I just say that, computers take things very literally, and I'd read something from a study just about a week ago when they had AI involved in a process of making a job offer to a person, and intentionally they gave a person a very low job offer, and the person said, "What, are you kidding me? This is the job offer?" And the AI went to reiterate the terms of the job offer and break it down. In other words, it didn't get the sarcasm or the frustration. And, there's always the saying, it's not what they say, it's what they do. So if you think about human conversation, sometimes people will talk about things that have nothing to do with the subject, and they're trying to maybe get somebody to relax, or maybe intimidate them, or whatever the case may be. But the conversations that people have and the words that they use, many times they're not meant to be taken figuratively. They're used as a strategy to achieve another outcome. And those are the things that tend to right now to be completely over the heads of most computers and AI processes.
Yep. Amen. Well, Randy, it's been wonderful chatting with you. I really appreciate your time today. Meg, I'm going to throw it back to you, but Randy, thank you so much.
Chris, it's been my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for your insights. It's been an amazing session, and thank you everyone for attending today. We did want to splash up Randy Bean's book, Fail Fast, Learn Faster. If you want to order it, it's available on Amazon today. And also visit www.appen.com. We have tons of resources and upcoming events just like this one, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you guys.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
everyone.
everyone. Have a good day.